Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to be here. This is the first of the webinar series for the Connex Tech Prize, titled Invasion versus Innovation, where we are going to dive in on invasive species topics and try to make them more accessible. We're aware that while we want to drive in new innovation into the invasive species space with the Connex Tech Prize, that it may be a little challenging to understand really where to start if you're not already familiar with invasive species. So in this webinar, we're hoping to provide an overview, first of invasive species ecology, and then talk about some specifics of how we're fighting them in the context of islands and the future of what we're looking at in terms of technology to address invasive species. So we're going to start general, we're going to go specific, and then we're going to go broad again. During this webinar, which is being recorded, we have a question and answer feature that you can use in the Zoom platform. So if you use that, we're going to have some time at the very end for a question and answer session with myself and with Island Conservation, who's joining us today. And we'll go ahead and get started and start talking about invasive species. So I'd like to thank and welcome David Will, who's a program manager at Island Conservation. Island Conservation is a global NGO whose mission is to prevent extinctions by removing invasive species from islands. They have a strong track record of working in partnership with local communities, government management agencies, and conservation organizations to plan and implement invasive species removal projects, resulting in the successful recovery of island ecosystems. Island Conservation is committed to finding new ways to tackle bigger and more complex islands so that we can save more island species from the brink of extinction. David Will is a GIS program manager at Island Conservation with nearly a decade of experience developing technology to improve operational decision-making during island restoration projects. He's managed GIS data collection and analysis during more than 15 eradication project campaigns across the globe, and continues to explore how emerging technologies and quantitative modeling can increase confidence in project success and in reducing overall cost. I am Tom Quigley, the community manager at Conservation X Labs for the Digital Makerspace, which many of you are familiar with, but it is our online platform for solvers to interact with conservation problems and propose new technologies and innovations to solve them. So we want to connect you with the great ideas to the resources, the people, and the people with the problems so that you can come together and start solving some of the most wicked conservation problems on the planet. And we're doing that with an incentive called the Connex Tech Prize, which I'll speak more about at the end of the call, but it's a funding incentive for you to create your very first ideas. And one of the categories of the Connex Tech Prize this year is invasive species. So we want to give you the information about invasives, as well as resources on where you can go to find out more once you start getting an idea. Now, as we go through the presentation, if you have something that you think of that you'd like to find out more about, because we'll be moving at a pretty high level and we'll move through some of these topics pretty rapidly, it's meant to be a high-level overview of invasive species and the technologies we're using. So if you have a question, drop it in the Q&A box, and we'll come back around to them at the very end and answer some of those questions. So let's go ahead and get started with the very highest level question that we have, which is, what is an invasive species? An invasive species is, the definition, with regard to a particular ecosystem, a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So it's a very specific definition. You can break it down into terrestrial and aquatic, and each of them have different challenges and different mitigation techniques. And then within each one of those, there are plant, vertebrate, invertebrate, or pathogens. We do include pathogens and introduced emerging diseases within the context of invasive species, as some of them can be really destructive to native or even agricultural communities in the ecosystem. Invasive species generally have a couple of shared attributes, and some of those are, it's good to know these as we're developing solutions for invasive species, but some of these are things like a very high birth rate. So a species that will have not one or two, but hundreds or thousands of viable offspring. Very fast growth. So something that doesn't take a very long time to get to maturity or to get to some level where it needs to take up a lot of resources. They can very quickly move up to a large body size or maturity. Generalist feeders for vertebrates or invertebrates and for plant invasives. This is more around being able to compete for space and sunlight. But that means generalist feeders is that they can eat a large amount of different things. So they don't specifically have to only have one type of food, which would make it not, it's not great when you're trying to move into a new ecosystem, which might have very unfamiliar foods to you. A lot of the times these organisms are very hardy. They can survive in a lot of different ecosystems. So for an example, the lionfish in the Caribbean, they've found that it can live not only in saltwater, but also in brackish and even freshwater. So that's not the case for a lot of other most other saltwater marine organisms. So very hardy, that they can survive quite a lot of different climatic conditions. Cryptic, or it can blend in very easily. That's either via camouflage or just by dint of being pretty hard to spot. And one of the big attributes that we've seen with invasive species is that they have a good relationship with humans. So by that I mean some species really suffer when there's a lot of human involvement around them, but some species do really well. Think about raccoons. They do quite well around humans, whereas some of the more fragile species will not. So if they can do well where human disturbances are, then they have a higher likelihood of being able to be invasive over time. Invasive species, not all introductions will end up being an invasive species. And remember our definition of invasive species, not all introduced species will even be considered invasive, because according to the definition, it's those that will create harm to the ecosystem or create harm to the economy or human well-being. There's a general rule of thumb called the 10% rule, where when you have a new introduction of a species into an environment, around 10% of those, as a rule of thumb, will actually survive. And that 10% has to actually create a small subpopulation within the ecosystem. So it's not enough for just 10% of the individuals to survive. They have to also create kind of a breeding population there. That's what we're talking about in terms of survival. And then out of those that are actually introduced, 10% of those that survive will end up really causing problems and being in that invasive category. Ecosystems also have attributes that will make them more or less likely to be invaded and damaged by invasive species. And we'll hear from David about the island ecosystems later. But there are different types of these. One, something very similar to the same region where the invader comes from. So they're already very well, they're well evolved to live and compete in that region. But also something that's very dissimilar in terms of an ecological niche, where perhaps there is something that is not at all used to a very competitive predator, or something that isn't used to any predators whatsoever. Those are two, there's kind of a conflict, but the similarity and the dissimilarity are both, we see ecosystems that are invaded by introduced species. And then any habitat that is disturbed, that has a high, either an amount of cyclones or environmental damage, or especially humans, those are likely to be invaded because they have this, already the ecosystem is under pressure, it's under stresses, and that means that something else, an introduced species, can take a foothold in that and grow rapidly. And the last bit I want to talk about in ecology of invasives is that primarily that we say that they have to be introduced because they need to be moved from their native ecosystem into the area that they're going to potentially invade. And those vectors are the pathways through which they move. Most of the time, those are human-caused pathways, whether that's a ballast water in a ship or if it's actual transportation of baggage, luggage, or freight. In one way or another, they're hitchhiking on some sort of vector to be introduced into this new region. So the vectors are really different they're very species specific, they're very region specific, but if you can identify what the vectors are of transmission, then that's the first step to approaching a new solution and trying to find a new innovation that will address that invasive species challenge. There's a few species that are pretty much globally thought of as real serious invasive species that cause problems basically to environment and ecology everywhere. And some of those are rats, cats and dogs, feral hogs, and mosquitoes. These are the ones that you can find now. They're pretty ubiquitous, but as you'll hear from David, especially rats, these can cause a massive amount of damage to ecosystems. And if you can find solutions for some of these kind of global invaders, then the potential for scale is really high, because these are invasive species that are problems all over on most continents except Antarctica. Then there are some more unusual suspects, which are more specific, and those can either be species specific, like lionfish taking foot in the Caribbean, zebra mussels or quagga mussels in the Great Lakes in the US, the brown tree snake in Guam. So it's very specific to a region. And because of the particular attributes of that region or the particular attributes of the species, that introduced species becomes invasive and causes a whole lot of harm. Then there are some that are species specific, such as the chytrid fungus in amphibians, which is an introduced fungus that hardens the outside of the skin of amphibians. So as amphibians breathe through their skin, they're not able to breathe anymore. It effectively chokes them, and it is incredibly viral and wiping out amphibian species all through Central and South America, and even appearing in North America as well. That's very specific to amphibians, not species, but a set of species as opposed to a geographic area. And then there's habitat specific things such as islands, which we'll hear much more about. And those are more tied to a habitat, a biome, something that is the region in which these live as opposed to a species or a geography. There are different levels of where we can make an intervention in terms of addressing these invasive species, and broken out broadly into prevention, eradication, containment, and then asset protection, which is sort of the final nuclear option once something has really taken a foothold. Prevention is stopping anything from getting in the first place. And so you'll see a lot of prevention happen at ports of entry, and making sure, especially if you've ever been to New Zealand or Australia, they're very, very strict on the border about biocontrol to make sure that prevention is really strong. And then there's eradication. Once you see something has actually been introduced into an area, to take that number back down to zero. And we'll hear from David about this successful eradication initiatives on islands. If that invasive species grows out of control for eradication, where that's no longer an option, we can move into containment, where we're trying to contain the damage and the spread of that. And then finally, if it really becomes a wildfire, the asset protection is looking at what species, what ecosystems, where can we hold and protect to maintain genetic and ecological viability over time. And the economic return down at the bottom, you can see, is much, much higher to prevent invasive species from coming into an area than it is from actually eradicating it once it's there. There are a lot of different types of solutions that I want you to be thinking about as we go more into some of the specifics around islands. There's examples of hardware solutions where we've seen ROVs that are made to hunt lionfish. There's software apps that can be used for invasive crop pests. There's synthetic biology even has been used to add a protein to corn that you may have heard of, BT corn, that stops it from being eaten by an invasive caterpillar. There's some low-tech solutions, the Matahari goats or Judas goats, which are used to bring out other goats from an environment in perhaps an island and eradicate them. Viral control, myxoma virus has been used very successfully on Australian rabbits in those populations to, I think, about a 98% success rate. Biocontrols, this is kind of a touchy one because some biocontrols, which is the introduction of a different species to control your first introduced species. And there's been really notable failures on this part, such as the cane toad, which was introduced in Australia to try to eat an invasive weevil and ended up becoming far, far worse than an invasive itself. But these biocontrols have had successes. One good example of it is the Lopezi wasp, which has really been a front line of defense against a crop pest that has been destroying cassava through Africa and Southeast Asia. Community events and social events such as lionfish derbies and hunting in the Caribbean, and of course direct conservation efforts such as the work that Island Conservation does. And with that, I'm going to hand it right over to David to continue on.
Thanks, Tom. It was a really great overview of invasive species, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that Island Conservation does and focus on islands. And Island Conservation, as Tom said, is a global nonprofit whose mission is to prevent the extinction of island species through the removal of invasive species. And let's move on to the next slide. And really, why do we focus on islands, and why a focus on these places in particular? And it's really because islands are at the epicenter of biodiversity. They represent less than 5% of the world's landmass, but have the highest concentration of animal and plant species due to their isolated geography and species evolution over time. And 75% of all bird, amphibian, mammal, and reptile extinctions have occurred on islands, and more than 40% of critically endangered species inhabit islands. And so really, those numbers kind of give you a sense of just how much of the world's biodiversity exists solely on islands. And if we look at all of those extinctions that are occurring on islands, invasive species are one of the primary drivers, with almost 86% of recorded extinctions linked to invasive species occurring on islands. And Tom gave a very good overview of what invasive species are. In the work that we do, and really with a focus on islands, invasive vertebrate species are one of the primary concerns for island ecosystems, and that again is rats, cats, goats, and pigs. And as Tom mentioned, these are non-native species that were introduced, and really importantly here, they were all introduced by people, either intentionally brought out to islands for various different reasons, or as stowaways. So really, when we think about this biodiversity crisis and extinction crisis, it is a human-created problem that we are trying to find solutions to. And pictured here is just an example of some of the impacts from Guadalupe Island in Mexico, a picture of 25 albatross that were killed by a single invasive cat on this island. So even thinking about just small numbers of species can have a pretty significant impact. Just one cat here in this example had a pretty large impact on the albatross population in Mexico. And further to some of those impacts, what are some of the impacts on islands? And we had that previous example of predation on species, but there's also some competition, and really these invasive species are disrupting ecological function. Pictured here in the top, also from Guadalupe Island, is a picture of an exclusion fence from goats, where one side is where goats roamed free and ate every last bit of vegetation. On the other side, where goats were excluded from, you can see native cypress trees and grasslands. Also pictured here is a albatross on Midway Island in the Pacific, and there's a few islands around the world where mites have recently become carnivorous and been attacking albatross, adult albatross, and having pretty significant impacts on their populations. That is of grave concern to these species. And also pictured here is Triangle Island in pull out, and invasive species also can have impacts on traditional livelihoods and food security. On Triangle, it's a matriarchal society, and invasive rats pose issues for all of the crops that are grown on the island, and also for traditional livelihoods that are impacting their abilities to generate money and continue their traditional ways of life. But the good news is that recovery is possible. It is possible to remove 100% of an invasive population, and this is really, again, another focus on islands. Again, thinking about this on a broader scale, islands are closed ecosystems, generally smaller than continental scales, and so it is easier and achievable to be able to completely remove 100% of a population from an island. And also, island ecosystems are incredibly resilient, and I can offer a few examples here. Pictured on top is Palmyra Atoll, where following the removal of invasive rats, there was a 5,000% increase in vegetation of the native forest. Also pictured here is the Pinzone tortoise. This tortoise was considered extinct in the wild, again, from the impacts of invasive rodents, and was only still around because of a long-term captive breeding program. But following the removal of invasive rats a few years ago, this is one of the first hatchings ever recorded in more than 100 years of tortoises born on Pinzone Island. And also in the Galapagos, following the removal of rats, there was a gecko species that was observed that had only previously ever been seen in fossil record. So we do see some pretty surprising results from the removal of these invasive species, and demonstrates just how resilient ecosystems are. And these benefits are not just restricted to terrestrial ecosystems. There has been significant amount of research that has shown that the removal of invasive vertebrates from islands also has significant benefits to marine ecosystems, with significant increases in coral reef and marine biomass on invasive-free islands compared to islands where there's invasive species. And I think a lot of this is driven by guano outputs from birds. So eradications on islands are a very successful tool. There's been more than 1,100 successful eradication projects on almost 800 islands worldwide. And there's a robust suite of tools and technologies that have been developed over time to remove invasive species from islands, but we are reaching the limits of these technologies. A lot of these islands are remote, uninhabited islands, and as we look towards the future, there are still lots of islands with significant amount of biodiversity that's being threatened. And so as we look towards innovation, our focus is on how can we achieve conservation benefits on larger inhabited islands, and how can we achieve these benefits on a regional or even continental scale. So if we look at some of the tools for tomorrow, it's really good to focus on some of the areas of greatest impact. And as we saw from some of those examples, some of the most significant impact and recovery results are on islands that are threatened by invasive rodents. Invasive rodents exist on nearly 80% of the world's islands and are one of the single biggest threats to island species. And so that is an area of greatest impact where innovation and technology can really move the field of island restoration forward. One of the other points of great impact is this concept of confirming zero, which is detecting animals at low densities and knowing when the last animal is gone. And as we look towards future projects like this, like Robinson Crusoe Island in Chile, this is a picture of a native hummingbird that's endemic just to this single island, and it's threatened by multiple invasive species, but also exists where there's island people living on the island. So we do need technologies to be able to move that project forward and see benefits to the species and prevent it from going extinct. So invasive rodents, what does the removal of invasive rodents look like? The current methods to remove rodents from islands is to use a conservation-specific rodenticide on an island, spread either by hand, helicopter, or a bait station. The largest eradication was recently completed on South Georgia Island in the sub-Antarctic, with covering more than 100,000 hectares. But this took 3 different seasons over 6 years, and was really only achievable because glaciers were preventing rodents from moving from one portion of the island to the other. If we were to look at islands of a similar size in a temperate or tropical context, the current tools would not be able to achieve an island that large. So really, there's limits to the size of islands that are achievable with the current tools. Also pictured here again is Kyangle Atoll. You can see there's a community there with the dock, and this is another challenge for invasive rodents. It's one thing to be able to remove invasive rodents from an island that is uninhabited, but when you have human habitation, trying to remove rodents from people's homes, that could have short-term impacts to their livelihood and their daily routines, is a much more significant challenge of getting the social acceptance to be able to move the project forward, and the social acceptance of the tools that you're using. And the other aspect of the current tools is that while they are highly specific to removing rodents, they aren't species specific. So there are other environmental effects and impacts of these tools. And pictured here as an example, this was a native mouse from Anacapa Island in the Channel Islands, where invasive rats were impacting both this native mouse, but other seabird species. And obviously, using a conservation bait rodenticide on the island would have impacts to this native mouse. So there were several thousand of these mice that were kept in captivity while the eradication project was undertaken, and then they were re-released after that project. And the population has since recovered, but there was short-term impacts, and the project was definitely much more complicated and costly because of that mitigation requirement. So as we look towards innovations for the future of invasive rodents, it really boils down to 2 key aspects. How do we increase the efficiency of these tools? And how do we increase the specificity of these tools? And a couple of examples of the technology that island conservation and others in the field are looking at is the use of drones. We just completed the first drone-powered rodent eradication project in the Galapagos a few weeks ago. And really, this is looking at helicopter operations are very expensive, very logistically time-consuming, and also require lots of specialized pilots with a high amount of experience. So looking at drones to reduce costs, automate, and reduce the barriers to entry would increase the efficiency of rodent eradication projects. We are also in partnership with a large number of other organizations looking into genetic tools that offer the ability to transform how these projects are done by making the eradication tools species specific. So this is looking at introducing transgenic mice that would only produce male offspring. So basically, as the rodents reproduced with each other, they would eliminate the reproductive capability in the population, and they would reproduce themselves until there was no rats or mice left on an island. So that obviously would be very specific to a single species and reduce some of the environmental effects, but there are also a lot of other ethical considerations that need to be taken in with those technologies. But those would certainly increase the specificity and really transform how these eradication projects were undertaken. The next aspect was the concept of confirming zero. One of the hardest parts of an invasive species eradication is knowing when you are done. It turns out that it's relatively easy to know if something is present on an island, but how do you know when not finding something means that it is gone? And here are just a couple of the different tools that have been employed on islands to confirm the presence and or absence of species. Pictured on the top is what's called a chew block. It's a piece of wax, sometimes with peanut butter, that's tagged into a tree, and rodents would chew onto that block and leave incisor marks, which would require staff to visit each of those, look for incisor marks, and confirm whether rodents were present or not. Pictured on the top right is someone using a spotlight to look for invasive rabbits. This is a lot of, hundreds of kilometers, hundreds or even thousands of person hours of walking around an island trying to physically look for an invasive species. On the bottom left is a picture of a camera trap that are often put out along trails or other areas to try and collect pictures of invasive species. And finally, on the bottom right is what's called a track pad, which is a sandy spot that's cleared, brushed clear, and then visually checked to see if there's footprints of an animal going by. So obviously, with all of these, some of the most significant challenges are that they require manual review and collection. There's a lot of personnel, time, and effort going to putting these out and checking all of them. But there's also a significant delay in response time. If we look at some of the track pads or cameras or chew blocks, from the time that an animal has been detected on those devices to the time that someone has actually gone and physically looked at that device, reviewed the information, you could be looking at weeks or months of time between when an animal was detected by the device and there's actually a management response. And then there's also the greater accumulation of all this information. How do you, given you've got hundreds or thousands of these devices out on an island, how do you accumulate all that data and aggregate it to know that you have certainty and absence? So really this boils down for innovations in detection. How do we improve the probability of detection, and how can we confirm absence sooner? And here are a few examples of some of the devices and technologies that are being used in that space. Pictured in the top left is an acoustic, a variety of different sensors, whether they're acoustic or biochemical sensors that are listening for, or in other words, smelling for invasive species, and being able to record and detect them. In the top right is the concept of using machine learning from camera trap images to automatically identify invasive species in those photos, reducing the amount of time needed to review all of those photos and increase the management response time. Also pictured here is drones either equipped with specialized cameras or specialized sensors, or drones used as data mules that would fly out to either a camera trap or an acoustic monitor and remotely download information, reducing the amount of time that people would have to actually go and physically visit these devices. Also pictured here is a smart trackpad. This is a device where an animal would walk across essentially some form of iPad or something similar, and would actually take a picture of the footprints and would automatically classify those footprints as a species. So again, looking at increasing the efficiency and probability of detecting a species. Some of the other technologies that are out that we're looking at are the concept of environmental DNA. So this, certainly in aquatic environments, but also in terrestrial environments, is the concept that species leave behind DNA in the environment as they move through an area. And is it possible to be able to collect that information from water samples or other sources and confirm the presence of a species by the DNA that they left behind? And finally, how do we aggregate all this information together to give you a degree of confidence in eradication? There are a number of statistical tools, Bayesian tools and otherwise, that are used to aggregate all of this information together, how much effort and versus how many detections, and collecting all that information together to give you a statistical amount of confidence that given 1,000 hours of search effort and 10,000 hours of camera traps, that you have a high degree of confidence. So it's trying to take a quantitative approach to aggregating all these detections and giving you a likelihood that when you're not detecting anything, it actually means that there's nothing there. So really, if we broaden this back out again from islands, we've been focusing on some examples from islands, but these sort of themes in both removal and detection are common across a whole suite of different invasive species problems, and it really boils down to, when we're talking about removing invasive species, how can innovative technologies increase the efficiency of these tools, and how can they increase the specificity of those tools? And when it comes to detection, how can technologies improve the probability of detecting the species, but also how can they aggregate information or provide a more timely notification of detection to empower rapid decision making. And there are a few large governmental challenges that have recently been initiated, calling for bold action on invasive species projects, and setting out challenges and visions that there aren't currently technologies in place to achieve those. And one example of that is that the Department of Conservation in New Zealand has declared a goal of making all of New Zealand rat, possum, and stoat free by 2050. And the current technologies do not currently allow for this to be achievable. And innovation is absolutely required to be able to achieve this vision. And it's more than just technology in removal and detection, but also when you think about municipalities and communities, how do you get social acceptance? How do you get citizen science involved? How do you get information of different cities, neighborhood groups, all trying to do their part to reach this vision? How do you coordinate all that information so you're actually making significant progress moving forward? So with that, Tom, I will pass it back off to you.
All right, I'm just going to take back control of the mouse here. Thank you so much, David. That's absolutely fantastic. As a wide range of information about invasives, both specifically on islands and the current technology being used to address them, as well as the areas of innovation. We did cover an awful lot through the last 40 minutes, so I want to let you know where you can go to find more. The best place is on the Digital Makerspace, which is the community platform that we host at Conservation X Labs. And there's a couple of areas specifically that you can go to for answers to any one of your questions. We'll also take questions at the end of this in just a few minutes. So if you have any questions that's been percolating in your mind over the last half hour, then ask them in the question and answer feature, and we'll come around to them in just a few minutes. But if you go to conservationx.com for the Digital Makerspace, you'll find detail on a number of those challenges that David described, specifically the confirming zero, where there's a lot of detail about how exactly we need that to be solved, and the constraints and challenges and the realities of working in the field with some of these rodents. And there's also a number of other challenges on invasive species specifically, including about the spread of the chytrid fungus, to save amphibian species across the North and South America, as well as one called Save the Ohia, which is a specific fungus that is wiping out a keystone species of tree in Hawaii. And we are actually also running a specific challenge on Save the Ohia itself. So while we're running this prize, the Connex Tech Prize, to potentially give you prototyping funds to launch your new innovation, at the same time, we're running a $70,000 prize, which is for anyone who can have innovations that will address the detection and halt the spread of that fungus that's wiping out that ohia tree. So these are simultaneous things that you could hit two rats with one stone, and potentially get some money to fund your next new project. On the Connex Tech Prize round 2 page, we're hosting a lot of different sources and resources that you can go to find out more information and to dive deeper into some of the specifics around the invasives in different areas. So on that page, which you can go to by conservationx.com/prize, scroll down to the bottom or hit the button that says discussion here in the tab, and you'll see a number of different resources that you can go into to understand a little bit more. There's 2 of those specific ones that I want to call out here. There's an invasives paper that we wrote at CXL and with a number of other partners, And that is a huge overview, not only of some of the invasive species that are challenges, but also really highlighting the new technologies and new innovations that are being used to address some of these challenges. So you can dive in on what's actually happening on the technology front to understand the scope of invasive species control. And then Island Conservation also has a number of databases that are available online. These are interactive maps that you can go to. You can export and download the files. You can go and sort and filter by different species, different locations, geographic ranges, and really get an understanding of where these eradications are occurring, what species are being affected, and what species are invading and really doing a lot of this harm and damage. And so before we get into questions, I want to remind you all about two things. One is the Connex Tech Prize, which is our initiative to give funding to new ideas that have the potential to be hugely impactful and innovative in the field of conservation. And we're specifically focusing on invasive species because, as you've heard, they have one of the highest impacts for extinctions on the planet. And our goal at Conservation X Labs is to end human-induced extinction. So we're funding 20 teams with $3,500 each to create the first prototype of their great idea. And then out of that, there will be a 10-week prototyping period where you will use those funds to create your very first model. And out of those, they will compete for one team to win $20,000. And that is pure prize money. We want to help you with unrestricted funds to take that forward in whatever way you deem would be best for your business or your new project. The submission time for this is March 13th, so hopefully this gives you a whole lot of different ideas that you can think about when it comes to invasive species, and will generate a lot of discussion afterwards on the digital makerspace. You can always comment on any of the stuff that we post there and ask individual questions. David is also active on the digital makerspace, so he can answer specific questions on there at after the end of this webinar. So submit by March 13th for the Connex Tech Prize. And we also have another number of other webinars that are opportunities for you to hear some information like this, to think about the process of innovation, to hear about technologies that are being used in both invasive and other areas to solve problems. Our next webinar is going to be on March 16th, titled How to Solve a Problem Like, and we're going to bring in a couple of really innovative speakers, one from Carnegie Mellon in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, and one, our own Alex Dagan, to speak about how to identify a problem out of a really thorny and very intimidating problem set, how to break those apart into individual problems, turn those into opportunities, and come up with a host of different ideas for a new innovation that can tackle those. So this is a really useful area if you're hearing a lot about these problems, but now have a better understanding of what the problems are, but are still not entirely sure of where to start or how to approach them. That's going to be a really useful one for you to sit in on as well. So you can register for that on the Google Sheets hyperlink, which I'll add to this thread in the digital makerspace afterwards. And then our third webinar is an open office hours for anybody who has any questions about the Connex Tech Prize. This is right before the submission of the prize. So at this point, we're hoping you have an idea or a few ideas and you're ready to start thinking about submitting or have a half-made or begun application. This is a time for you to sit down with me and with a number of other collaborators on the Connex Tech Prize and to ask questions so that we can give you answers and help you produce the very best idea and the best application that you can. So I want to go to questions now. And I'd like to keep them focused on the content of the webinar in terms of invasive species control, in terms of the technology and innovation that's being used to address invasive species, and questions about the Connex Tech Prize specifically we can save for the office hours on Monday, March 11th. So that's a good time to come if you have those questions. And of course, you can also always email me or post on the digital makerspace and I'll be quick to respond. So I'm gonna go to the questions and answer section. If you have any specific questions right now as we're talking, you think of something, you can go ahead and post them in the Q&A feature. I got a question from Tristan Copley-Smith, which is directed at David here. how do you decide which species to really focus on, and especially to prioritize when it comes to invasive species eradication? And if you're looking at scale especially, how do you prioritize which ones of these to address first?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. And I think one of the databases that Tom mentioned, the Threatened Island Biodiversity Database, was really focused on answering just that question. And that was going through and looking at the entire IUCN Red List, which categorizes threat levels to species, and going and figuring out where those species occurred on islands. And then also working with regional species experts and island experts to figure out where invasive species also occurred on those islands. And that gave us this huge data set of all the islands in the world, where are there threatened species, where are there invasive species, and then going through and looking at kind of coming up with the scoring mechanism for where can a single intervention have the most bang for your buck. And that generated a list of 100 important islands where we can focus our efforts on, where the removal of invasive species will have the most conservation benefit. And I believe that paper is been accepted to +1 and should be coming out relatively soon for everyone to see. But there was a prioritization process that did help us figure out where to prioritize that effort.
Great, thank you, David. And I've got another question for you from Zen Girl, which is specific around the mice becoming carnivorous on one of those atolls. I don't precisely remember which. The question is, did you determine the cause for the mice making that switch and starting to attack the albatross? Is it a climate change causing lack of food for the mice, or some other type of unknown still?
It's my understanding that it's still unknown. I think one of the really interesting things about that is this has actually occurred on 3 or 4 islands separately all around the world. One Midway Atoll in the Pacific, Gough Island in the Mid-Atlantic, and Mariana Island, which is, I believe, more over in the Indian Ocean. And so these are islands that are scattered across the globe, where within the last 5 to 10 years, that mice have kind of made the switch to being carnivorous and attacking the albatross. And really, as far as I'm aware, we aren't quite sure why that is happening, but we do know that it is having a huge impact because they are attacking the adult albatross, which is impacting the long-term breeding success of those populations. And so this is kind of a conservation emergency, and there's a lot of fundraising and effort looking to tackling those specific islands to eliminate this problem.
Great, and certainly we're also one of those funders that is hoping to pour some new liquidity into ideas that are addressing some of those specific issues, and there's real opportunities for them to scale with partners like Island Conservation to actually take some of these ideas that you're coming up with and start to see them tested and implemented in the field. So it's not just a one-off idea or a pie in the sky. It actually has some execution and implementation out the other side, which is really unique. So if there's no more questions, I think I might have one more here. Last question here. What's the most effective example of technological conservation that you are aware of? And that's a very broad one. We can focus on invasive species specifically, or we can focus on something broader. So I'll throw that one to you first, David, and then I'll give an answer.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I certainly just off the top of my head thinking about invasive rodents. Again, the use of agricultural buckets and GPS units to be able to track and use helicopters to do a rodenticide application on islands was a pretty significant an effective example of innovation. Previously, rodent eradications had been just done by hand or by base station, which really limited the size of being able to do those projects. And I think some of the early rodent eradication projects were using kind of fire buckets to be able to spread the rodenticide conservation bait onto the island. So the technologies in that space really transformed our ability to do those projects and made hundreds and hundreds of more projects achievable. So that's just one example.
And you said that originally you were using fire buckets, but then you went to an agricultural bucket. What was that bucket being used for?
That bucket had previously been used for spreading seed and fertilizer. So this was kind of taking technologies from other sectors, taking it from the agricultural sector in this purpose, and using it for conservation specific uses. So there was, enough similarities between, being able to spread seed or fertilizer for agricultural purposes, that someone was able to take that and apply it to a conservation specific context. We can take that technology, make some modifications to the equipment, make some modifications to some of the technologies, and really developing a standard of practice. I think that was probably the most important part, was not just developing the technology itself, but also developing how should the technology be applied, and building a use case over time of multiple different projects and seeing it used in different places, in different contexts that really help move it forward. So there's not only just the technology aspect of it, but there's also kind of establishing a best practice and building the knowledge of building from one project to the next, to the next, to the next.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's also a really great example of the use of analogs, something that has solved a very similar problem in some other field that just hasn't diffused yet into another field where there's a really similar need. And we see that in a lot of different things. And I think it's a really hopeful message as well, is that one, we don't have all the answers. We are actively seeking help. But two, these answers do exist. They're being used in other areas, just for a different method, slightly different. So if you can identify something that has a similar purpose or a similar mechanism, then you can potentially find something that has a really good tie-in for your very specific problem set that can have a massive transformative effect in the field that you're looking at, which is in this case invasive species. And I think personally, one of the things that I've seen, the paradigm that we've seen over the last few decades is the rise of the mobile network and the ubiquity of the internet. And I think that has led to a lot of opportunities for new technologies to appear, both in the communication side for specific kind of islands and invasive species technology, where, David, we're looking at a lot of different applications of using connectivity over a large island area to more remotely monitor some of these areas to confirm zero, as opposed to sending people out on days of 10-mile hikes over a long period of time. And I think also, not just on that specific area, but on a larger area, when it comes to invasive species eradication on not a very small size limited island, but in a large island full, or a large area full of people, the community aspect really comes into play. And it's no longer, just the environment and the species in isolation. It has a real interface with humans and the way that we live our everyday lives. And I think that technology such as, for example, iNaturalist is a really interesting example of this, where people are actively using this to identify species in a certain area. And a lot of the times it's an app that'll use machine learning to identify what species you are looking at if you take a photo of it. And if you happen to have, something that you look at and you go, I don't recognize that, I've never seen it before, and you take a photo, it has the potential to be a front-line prevention measure for invasive species coming into an area that actually activates the community and brings them into the fold, as opposed to fighting against behavior or trying to tell tell people to keep out or don't touch nature. It's an active and engaged initiative. Okay, that's about all the time that we have. I want to make sure that everybody has, I'll give you 4 minutes back of your life, and I want to thank David and Island Conservation for taking the time to sit and to speak with us. Thank you so much for everybody who took the time to attend today. Really appreciate, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of your ideas come through on the digital makerspace. We are recording this webinar and we will post it online. We'll post it on the digital makerspace, and if you have any further questions or anybody watching this at a later date has a question about anything we've discussed today, you can drop it in the comments section and we'll be there to shoot you some answers. All of the resources that we talked about today are also hosted on the digital makerspace at conservationx.com/prize. And don't forget that March 13th is the deadline for submissions to the Connex Tech Prize, where we're giving away $90,000 to 20 different teams for their ideas in invasive species. Thank you, everybody, very much for attending, and have a great rest of your day.